December 26th, 211 AD. In the marble halls of the Roman imperial palace, a mother's screams echo through chambers that have witnessed centuries of power and glory. Julia Domner, Empress of Rome, cradles her dying son as his blood soaks through her robes. The killer, his own brother. This isn't just another tale of imperial violence. This is the moment when familial bonds died at the altar of absolute power. Two young men born 11 months apart to Emperor Septimius Sais had been destined to rule the greatest empire the world had ever known. Raised as partners, educated as equals, groomed to share the purple of imperial authority, their father's vision was revolutionary. Joint emperors working in perfect harmony to govern territories stretching from Britain's misty shores to Egypt's golden sands. Instead, Lucius Septimius Bassianus, known to history as Caracalla, would orchestrate one of antiquity's most calculated betrayals. His younger brother Geta would die not on a distant battlefield or through political maneuvering, but through intimate deception in their mother's arms. What followed wasn't just murder, but systematic genocide. 20,000 souls eliminated to secure one man's paranoid grip on power. The Roman Empire had survived civil wars, barbarian invasions, and political upheavals that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. But this crime struck at something deeper, the fundamental trust that held society together. When brothers raised for cooperation chose annihilation instead, they didn't just destroy each other. They shattered the very concept of shared leadership and unleashed forces that would haunt Rome for generations. Ancient historian Cassius Dio would later write that the empire had never witnessed such hatred between those who shared imperial blood. Yet this wasn't spontaneous rage or momentary madness. Caracalla's crime was methodically planned, coldly executed, and ruthlessly expanded into a purge that redefined the nature of Roman autocracy. Tonight, we uncover how privilege became poison, how joint inheritance transformed into a death sentence, and how two young men's inability to share power helped accelerate the decline of history's greatest empire. This is the story of the day brotherhood died in Rome and took the empire's soul with it. Our journey begins not with the murder itself, but with the circumstances that made such unthinkable violence seem inevitable to a young man drunk on absolute power and consumed by paranoid hatred. Septimius Sais arrived in Rome not as a continuation of established tradition, but as a revolutionary force that would reshape imperial politics forever. Unlike previous dynasties rooted in centuries of Roman aristocracy, Sais was an outsider born in Leptis Magna, raised speaking Punic before Latin, and carrying the distinct features of North African heritage in a capital still dominated by Italian nobility. His path to power came through the chaos of 193 AD, the year of 5 emperors, when competing claimants butchered each other for the throne. Severus commanded the powerful Danubian legions, hardened troops who had spent decades fighting Germanic tribes, and understood that survival depended on backing the strongest leader. When civil war erupted, they chose correctly. Victory through violence, however, created unique challenges for legitimacy. Previous emperors could claim divine selection, senatorial approval, or hereditary right. Sais possessed none of these advantages. Instead, he built his authority on military success, administrative competence, and a carefully crafted narrative about destiny that would culminate in his son's shared rule. The emperor's marriage to Julia Domner proved as politically astute as it was personally fulfilling. This Syrian noblewoman brought intellectual brilliance, extensive political connections, and access to Eastern wealth that complemented Sois's Western military strength. More importantly, she understood how to navigate the complex world of imperial court politics while maintaining her own independent authority. When Caracalla was born in 188 AD, followed by Geta in 189 AD, they represented more than just heirs to the throne. They embodied Sois's vision of a new kind of imperial dynasty, one that combined African pragmatism, Syrian sophistication, and Roman institutional knowledge. These weren't traditional princes waiting for their father's death, but active partners being prepared for immediate power sharing. The boy's education reflected this revolutionary approach. While previous imperial heirs had been trained primarily in Roman traditions, Caracalla and Geta studied Greek philosophy alongside Latin rhetoric, Eastern diplomatic practices alongside Western military strategy. They learned to see the empire not as a Roman possession, but as a cosmopolitan confederation requiring diverse leadership approaches. Yet even during these formative years, observers noted troubling differences between the brothers. Caracalla displayed the aggressive energy that appealed to soldiers but alarmed courtiers. Geta showed intellectual curiosity that impressed philosophers but seemed weak to military commanders. These contrasts, initially viewed as complementary strengths, gradually became competing visions of imperial leadership. When Severus elevated both sons to imperial rank, he was attempting something unprecedented in human history: the institutionalization of shared absolute power. Previous examples of joint rule had involved temporary arrangements or clear hierarchical divisions. Severus envisioned something far more ambitious and dangerous: true equality between co-emperors with identical authority over the same territories. The practical challenges became apparent immediately. Every imperial decision required consultation between two young men whose approaches to governance diverged significantly. Military appointments that Caracalla approved on grounds of battlefield experience, Geta might reject for lacking diplomatic finesse. Provincial policies that satisfied Geta's emphasis on legal precedent often frustrated Caracalla's preference for direct action. Roman imperial protocol developed over centuries to accommodate a single supreme authority proved inadequate for joint rule. Court ceremonies became elaborate, choreographed performances designed to maintain the appearance of equality while avoiding situations that might trigger conflict. Even simple activities like receiving foreign ambassadors required complex negotiations about precedence, speaking order, and ceremonial positioning. The financial implications alone threatened imperial stability. Maintaining two complete courts, each with its own staff, guards, advisors, and ceremonial requirements, doubled many traditional expenses. More dangerously, both brothers began competing for military loyalty through increasingly generous bonuses and privileges, creating unsustainable fiscal pressures while establishing precedents that future emperors would exploit. Palace life became a surreal exercise in managed separation. Architects literally redesigned the imperial residence to accommodate two sovereign authorities who could no longer tolerate each other's presence. Walls were constructed, guard posts established, and separate entrances created within what had once been a unified living space. The heart of Roman power resembled nothing so much as a militarized border zone. Provincial governors found themselves navigating contradictory commands from equally legitimate sources. A policy directive from Caracalla might arrive simultaneously with conflicting instructions from Geta, leaving administrators to choose between competing loyalties with potentially fatal consequences. The empire's legendary administrative efficiency began deteriorating under the weight of this systematic confusion. The Senate, already marginalized by decades of imperial autocracy, discovered new levels of powerlessness. Senators attempting to maintain relationships with both emperors found themselves suspected of duplicity by each. Those who chose sides risked violent retribution if they backed the wrong brother. The institution that had once governed the Republic became a paralyzed spectator to imperial dysfunction. Severus's death in York during February 211 AD marked the point of no return for his son's relationship. The emperor's final months had been spent campaigning in Scotland, attempting to pacify tribes that threatened Rome's northern British frontier. Both princes accompanied their father, gaining valuable military experience while witnessing the brutal realities of imperial warfare. The dying emperor's famous deathbed advice, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men," would become history's most tragically ironic counsel, intended to preserve his dynasty and secure the empire. These words instead provided a roadmap for its destruction. Harmony proved impossible. Military enrichment led to fiscal catastrophe, and scorning others justified unprecedented purges. Suspicions of patricide, though historically unfounded, reveal how completely trust had collapsed between the brothers. In the paranoid atmosphere surrounding Severus' final illness, each son wondered whether the other might hasten their father's death for personal advantage. Natural illness became potential poisoning. Every symptom suggested possible assassination. Medical treatment was viewed through lenses of political calculation. The funeral arrangements themselves became a preview of coming conflicts. Both brothers claimed the right to deliver primary eulogies, lead ceremonial processions, and receive the army's oath of loyalty. What should have been a solemn tribute to their father's achievements instead became a competition for political advantage that scandalized even hardened military veterans. The return journey to Rome transformed into separate royal progresses that emphasized division rather than unity. Caracalla and Geta traveled different routes, stopped at different cities, and held separate audiences with local officials. Instead of presenting a united front to the empire, they demonstrated that Roman power now had two competing centers of authority. A rival in the capital completed the brothers' estrangement. The physical division of the palace became absolute and irreversible with internal walls, separate guard units, and independent administrative staffs. Contemporary sources describe a residence that resembled a fortress divided against itself, where imperial family members required armed escorts to move between different sections of their own home. The psychological impact on both young men was devastating. Caracalla, naturally inclined toward suspicion, became convinced that Geta represented an existential threat to his survival. Geta, more trusting by nature, gradually realized that his brother viewed their shared inheritance as a zero-sum competition that could only end in one emperor's elimination. The year following Severus's death witnessed the unprecedented spectacle of an empire governed by two sovereigns who refused to appear together publicly, communicate directly, or coordinate policies in any meaningful way. This wasn't the shared rule that had been envisioned, but something far more dangerous. A Cold War conducted at the heart of Roman civilization. Military units found themselves choosing between competing loyalties based not on institutional duty, but personal relationships with individual emperors. The Taurian Guard, traditionally the emperor's personal protection force, split into rival factions that viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. Soldiers who had once shared common cause now eyed their comrades as potential enemies in a civil war that seemed increasingly inevitable. Economic consequences rippled throughout the empire as trade relationships deteriorated under the strain of conflicting policies and uncertain legal enforcement. Merchants who had built fortunes on the stability of Roman commercial law discovered that contracts approved by one emperor might be invalidated by the other. Provincial taxation became chaotic as different imperial agents claimed authority over the same territories. The brothers' competition for popular support led to increasingly elaborate public spectacles and generous distributions of money to Roman citizens. These expensive displays of imperial favor, while temporarily successful in maintaining public order, created dangerous precedents for future rulers while depleting treasury reserves needed for essential government functions. Intellectual and cultural life suffered as philosophers, writers, and artists found themselves forced to choose sides in the imperial divide. Julia Domner's famous salon, once a gathering place for the empire's greatest minds, became another casualty of political polarization as scholars aligned themselves with competing factions or fled to safer locations outside the capital. Religious institutions traditionally above political faction became drawn into the imperial conflict as each brother sought divine sanction for his authority. Priests found themselves offering separate sacrifices for the health and success of competing emperors, while temples became unofficial gathering places for rival political groups. The psychological toll on ordinary Romans was equally severe. Citizens who had grown up believing in the permanence and stability of imperial institutions now witnessed their casual destruction by two young men more concerned with the personal rivalry than public welfare. The confidence that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries began eroding under the weight of visible imperial dysfunction. Julia Domner found herself in perhaps the most tragic position in Roman history. A woman of exceptional ability and influence, watching helplessly as her sons destroyed everything she had helped create. As the only person both emperors still trusted, she became the sole remaining bridge between two increasingly hostile camps, a role that would ultimately make her an unwitting accomplice to Fratric's side. Her attempts at reconciliation took increasingly desperate forms. Private family dinners became elaborate negotiations requiring diplomatic protocols normally reserved lenses of political calculation. The funeral arrangements themselves became a preview of coming conflicts. Joint hunting expeditions were organized with military precision to prevent spontaneous conflicts. Religious ceremonies became carefully choreographed performances designed to demonstrate familial unity to skeptical audiences. The empress's position grew more precarious as courtiers and officials demanded exclusive loyalty. Her natural inclination toward neutrality became politically untenable when both sons began viewing any contact with their brother's supporters as potential betrayal. Julia discovered that maintaining relationships with both children required constant vigilance and increasingly complex deceptions. Her intellectual circle, once the pride of the severe court, gradually disbanded as philosophers and writers were forced to choose political sides. The cultural renaissance that had marked the early years of the dynasty withered in an atmosphere where artistic expression might be interpreted as political statement. Julia watched her life's work disappear along with her son's relationship. Financial pressures compounded her political isolation. Maintaining separate relationships with both imperial courts required enormous resources for gifts, entertainments, and ceremonial obligations. More seriously, the brothers' fiscal competition forced her to make increasingly expensive gestures of support to maintain her position with each faction. The Empress's health began deteriorating under the enormous stress of her impossible situation. Contemporary sources describe a woman aged beyond her years by the constant tension of mediating between two absolute rulers who had moved beyond rational negotiation. Her legendary political skills proved inadequate against the depths of her son's mutual hatred. Most tragically, Julia gradually realized that her peacemaking efforts might actually be making the situation worse. Each arranged meeting provided new opportunities for misunderstanding and conflict. Her presence as a neutral party became a source of suspicion rather than comfort, as both sons wondered whether she secretly favored their rival. Caracalla's decision to murder his brother wasn't a moment of passionate rage, but the culmination of months of careful planning. By late 211 AD, he had concluded that the fundamental problem wasn't political or administrative, but existential. Rome wasn't large enough for both of them to survive. The solution required not compromise, but elimination, executed with sufficient cunning to avoid triggering civil war. The conspiracy's success depended on recruiting accomplices who possessed both absolute loyalty and the stomach for fratricide. Caracalla chose carefully from among centurions and tribunes who had served under him during the British campaigns. Men whose careers depended entirely on his continued favor and who had demonstrated their willingness to follow orders without question. Timing proved crucial to the plot's success. Caracalla needed to strike when Geta's supporters were either absent from Rome or otherwise unable to respond quickly to prevent his brother's murder or organize immediate retaliation. This required careful monitoring of key allies' movements in coordination with broader military positioning throughout the capital. The selection of Julius' chambers as the murder site represented the conspiracy's most cynical element. By using their mother's desperate desire for reconciliation as the pretext for the fatal meeting, Caracalla ensured that Geta would arrive without additional protection, while simultaneously guaranteeing maximum psychological impact. The location's emotional significance made detection virtually impossible. Creating plausible justification for the assassination required elaborate preparation. Caracalla's agents spread rumors about Geta's alleged disloyalty and treasonous plotting, establishing a narrative that could be used to legitimize the murder after the fact. These stories, however implausible, would provide legal cover for the subsequent purges and executions. The psychological pressure of planning such an elaborate deception began affecting Caracalla's behavior in ways that concerned even his closest supporters. He became increasingly erratic, prone to violent outbursts, and paranoid about potential threats to his own safety. The stress of maintaining normal imperial routine while secretly orchestrating fratricide created mental strain that would mark him permanently. Security arrangements for the conspiracy required extraordinary complexity. Caracalla needed to ensure that loyalist troops controlled key points throughout the palace while maintaining the appearance of normal operations. Any unusual military activity might alert Geta's supporters or arouse his suspicions about the proposed meeting's true purpose. December 26, 2111. AD began like any other winter day in the imperial palace with routine ceremonies, administrative meetings, and the careful diplomatic dance that had become necessary to maintain the fiction of joint rule. Neither Julia Donner nor Geta suspected that Caracalla's sudden willingness to attend a reconciliation meeting represented anything more than a welcome breakthrough in their long campaign for family unity. The Empress had carefully prepared her chambers for what she hoped would be a turning point in her son's relationship. The room was arranged to emphasize familial intimacy rather than imperial ceremony, with comfortable seating arranged to encourage informal conversation. Julia had even dismissed most of her usual attendants to create the private atmosphere that both brothers had demanded for any serious negotiation. When Gator arrived, he found Caracalla already present and apparently engaged in earnest discussion with their mother about the Empire's future. The scene appeared natural and spontaneous, exactly as Caracalla had intended. The elder brother had positioned himself strategically near the chamber's entrance, while centurions loyal to him waited in adjacent rooms, ready to respond to his predetermined signal. The initial moments proceeded according to both Julia's hopes and Caracalla's deadly plan. Both brothers exchanged the formal greetings required by imperial protocol and embraced their mother with apparent affection. Julia began speaking about family unity and their sacred duty to their father's memory. For several minutes, genuine reconciliation seemed possible. Then everything changed in an instant. At Caracalla's signal, armed soldiers burst through the chamber doors. Gator, realizing immediately that he had been betrayed, attempted to reach his mother for protection, a desperate instinct that ensured the murder would occur in the most emotionally devastating way possible. Julia's arms became not sanctuary, but the setting for her son's execution. The killing itself was swift, but brutal. Multiple soldiers struck simultaneously, ensuring quick completion while diffusing individual responsibility for the Emperor's death. Gator died almost instantly, but not before crying out to his mother in anguish and disbelief. His blood soaked Julia's robes as she screamed in horror at witnessing her worst nightmare realized. Caracalla's immediate reaction revealed the psychological preparation that had made such calculated violence possible. Rather than showing remorse or shock, he began implementing the next phase of his plan, spreading the fabricated story that Getter had attempted to assassinate him, and that the killing had been necessary self-defense. The speed of this transition from fratricide to propaganda demonstrated how thoroughly he had planned every aspect of the crime. The murder of Getter was merely the beginning of Caracalla's campaign to eliminate all potential threats to his newfound position as sole emperor. What followed represented one of history's most systematic and extensive purges, a bloodbath that would consume an estimated 20,000 lives and fundamentally transform the character of Roman imperial administration. Caracalla's immediate priority involved eliminating Getter's personal supporters and potential avengers. This included not only high-ranking political allies and military officers, but also servants, freedmen, and anyone whose loyalty to the murdered emperor might translate into future opposition. The scope of these killings was unprecedented, targeting individuals based on association rather than any specific treasonous acts. The legal framework for mass execution was provided through an elaborate fiction portraying Getter as a traitor who had plotted against both his brother and the Roman state. Imperial propagandists claimed that the fatal meeting had been arranged by Gator as an opportunity to murder Caracalla, and that the surviving emperor had acted purely in self-defense. This narrative, however implausible, created sufficient legal cover for the subsequent campaign of terror. Provincial administrators who had demonstrated loyalty to Gator found themselves recalled to Rome under false pretenses only to face immediate execution upon arrival. Military officers who had served under his command were systematically eliminated or transferred to positions where they posed no threat. Even minor bureaucrats and clerks who had worked in offices associated with the murdered emperor discovered that their employment history had become a death sentence. The purge created a climate of terror that paralyzed imperial administration throughout the empire. No one could predict whether past associations might suddenly become fatal liabilities. Officials began competing to demonstrate their loyalty to Caracalla through denunciations and accusations that claimed even more lives, creating a cascade of violence that fed on itself. Economic confiscation accompanying the executions provided short-term revenue for the imperial treasury while creating long-term administrative chaos. The elimination of experienced administrators and the climate of fear surrounding government service made it increasingly difficult to recruit capable replacements. Many positions remained vacant for months, disrupting essential government functions. The psychological impact on Caracalla himself proved equally destructive. Having crossed the ultimate moral boundary through fratricide, he became increasingly paranoid about potential threats to his own life. Every conversation might conceal conspiracy. Every gesture could signal betrayal. Every relationship represented possible danger. This paranoia would drive additional acts of violence throughout his reign. With his brother dead and potential opponents eliminated, Caracalla achieved the goal he had claimed to desire: sole mastery of the Roman Empire. However, the methods employed to reach this position had fundamentally altered both his character and the nature of imperial rule itself. The young man once groomed for cooperative leadership had become a paranoid autocrat whose reign would be marked by increasing violence and instability. The systematic erasure of Geta's memory became an imperial obsession that consumed enormous resources and administrative effort. Statues were destroyed, inscriptions were altered, coins were recalled and melted down, and official documents were revised to eliminate any reference to the murdered emperor. This damnatio memorial represented more than symbolic rejection. It was an attempt to rewrite history itself. Caracalla's relationship with traditional Roman institutions deteriorated rapidly as his paranoia infected every aspect of governance. The Senate, once a partner in imperial administration, found itself reduced to a ceremonial body whose members lived in constant fear of arbitrary execution. Senators who had previously enjoyed access to the imperial court now approached the palace knowing that any meeting might be their last. Military policy reflected the emperor's desperate need to maintain army loyalty through increasingly expensive concessions. Massive pay increases were granted to all legions, depleting the treasury while establishing dangerous precedents for future military demands. The recruitment of barbarian mercenaries accelerated as traditional Roman recruitment methods proved inadequate for the emperor's expanding security needs. The emperor's personal behavior became increasingly bizarre and threatening. He began seeing himself as a reincarnation of Alexander the Great, adopting Macedonian royal protocols and requiring visitors to prostrate themselves in his presence. This megalomania alienated traditional supporters while creating new categories of potential enemies among those who refused to participate in his grandiose fantasies. Justice under Caracalla became arbitrary and capricious, undermining centuries of careful legal development that had been one of Rome's greatest contributions to civilization. Court decisions were based on imperial mood rather than established precedent, creating uncertainty that made normal commercial and social relationships increasingly difficult to maintain. The economic policies of this period were driven primarily by the need to fund military expenses and grandiose building projects designed to glorify the emperor's reign. Tax collection became more aggressive and punitive, driving many communities to financial ruin. Currency debasement began in earnest as silver reserves were stretched through the addition of base metals, creating inflationary pressures that would plague the empire for decades. The assassination of Caracalla by his own Taurian prefect in 217 AD ended one of Rome's most destructive reigns, but the damage inflicted through his murder of Geta and subsequent reign of terror could not be undone simply by removing the perpetrator. The precedents established and institutions corrupted would continue poisoning Roman politics for generations, contributing to the political chaos that would characterize the remainder of the 3rd century. The immediate aftermath revealed how thoroughly Caracalla's paranoid rule had weakened the empire's fundamental structures. The Taurian Guard, corrupted by years of bribes and political manipulation, abandoned their traditional role as stabilizers of imperial succession. Instead, they auctioned the throne to the highest bidder, beginning a period of military anarchy where emperors were made and unmade at the whim of competing armies. The Senate's capacity for providing alternative leadership had been so thoroughly destroyed that it proved incapable of asserting authority during the succession crisis. Senators who survived the Severan purges were primarily those who had demonstrated their willingness to submit without question. This loss of institutional independence created a power vacuum that would be filled by increasingly unstable military strongmen. The professional Roman army, courted so assiduously by Caracalla through generous pay and privileges, had learned that imperial power ultimately depended on their willingness to support particular claimants. This lesson spawned a series of military coups and civil wars as different legions promoted their own candidates for supreme authority. The discipline that had made Roman forces invincible was gradually replaced by mercenary calculations of immediate personal advantage. Economic damage proved even more persistent than political disruption. The currency debasement begun during Caracalla's reign accelerated under his successes, leading to serious inflation and the breakdown of traditional commercial relationships. The tax burden imposed to fund military expenditures and imperial laresses crushed provincial communities and contributed to the urban decline that would mark the later empire. Perhaps most significantly, the murder of Geta had demonstrated that there were ultimately no effective restraints on imperial power beyond the emperor's personal character and judgment. This realization fundamentally altered relationships between ruler and rule throughout the empire. Citizens who had previously seen themselves as participants in a great civilizing mission began viewing themselves as subjects of an arbitrary and potentially violent autocracy. The cultural consequences proved equally profound and lasting. The confidence and optimism that had characterized Roman civilization at its height was replaced by a defensive mentality focused on survival rather than achievement. Great building projects, literary works, and philosophical inquiries became luxuries few could afford in an atmosphere of political instability and economic decline. The tragedy of Geta and Caracalla transcends the boundaries of ancient history to illuminate timeless truths about power, family, and the fragility of civilized society. These 2 young men, blessed with every advantage their world could offer and educated to rule wisely, chose destruction over cooperation, murder over compromise, and paranoia over trust. In doing so, they didn't merely destroy themselves, they helped destroy the empire they had been raised to protect. Their story wasn't predetermined by fate or circumstance. At countless moments, different choices could have led to vastly different outcomes. The Roman Empire might have benefited from effective joint leadership, enhanced administrative efficiency, and the kind of stable succession that had eluded previous dynasties. Instead, personal hatred overwhelmed public duty, creating a cascade of destruction that extended far beyond the original participants. The broader implications of their failure extend beyond Roman history to fundamental questions about human nature and political organization. When personal relationships become subordinated to political ambition, when trust gives way to suspicion, and when cooperation transforms into zero-sum competition, the resulting damage threatens the foundations of any society. Institutions that take generations to build can be destroyed in moments by individuals who place personal interests above collective welfare. Caracalla's conviction that Rome wasn't large enough for both brothers proved to be a fatal miscalculation. By eliminating Geta, he didn't solve the fundamental challenges of imperial governance. He simply removed one potential solution while creating numerous new problems. His subsequent reign demonstrated that absolute power achieved through violence and maintained through terror was ultimately more destructive than any shared authority he had found intolerable. The precedent established by Geta's murder, that family members were obstacles to be eliminated rather than partners to be cultivated, would haunt Roman politics for centuries. Future emperors remembered that brothers, sons, and cousins could be potential threats requiring preemptive elimination. The bonds of blood and marriage that had once provided stability became sources of suspicion and violence. Modern observers might wonder how two intelligent young men, raised in luxury and educated by history's finest teachers, could make such catastrophically poor decisions. The answer lies in the corrupting nature of absolute power itself. When individuals possess the authority to reshape society according to their personal preferences, the temptation to eliminate inconvenient obstacles, including family members, becomes almost irresistible. The Roman Empire survived the immediate trauma of Caracalla's reign, but it was never quite the same. The confidence and stability that had characterized imperial civilization's golden age had been shattered by the revelation that emperors could be as petty, violent, and destructive as common criminals. The precedents established during this period would contribute to centuries of political instability that eventually transformed the empire into something unrecognizable from its earlier greatness. In the end, the blood that flowed in Julia Donner's chambers on December 26, 211 AD, represented more than one young emperor's death. It marked the end of an ideal, the destruction of a dream, and the beginning of an age when brotherhood became synonymous with rivalry, when family ties became chains of suspicion, and when the very concept of shared power became a recipe for mutual annihilation. Both brothers died that day, one literally, the other spiritually, and with them died something essential in the soul of Rome itself.